Hi, my name is Jillian, and Lynn asked me here to talk about my recovery process. And so I'm going to start at the point where I started at Rosewood. And so I came here after having been in treatment 2 other times, and I never felt like recovery would be something that I could do. I heard a lot of people who were in recovery, they had come and spoke. I had gone to so many groups, so many therapy sessions, but nothing stuck, and nothing had convinced me that I would ever be someone who could be sitting here and speaking about recovery. I just never thought it was possible. And so I started out here in IOP seeing a bunch of people who were on their way out of treatment and doing well, and I just never felt like I could never be them. And so I got to such a low point that I really felt like it was my bottom, where I would just be using behaviors all day long, and I would get home at night and be super frustrated, feel like I just had tried different coping skills, they didn't work, nothing worked, and I would sit there and feel like I had 2 options. I would either be able to purge or self-harm and use a behavior of some sorts, or I would just end up killing myself. And so every night it was that decision, and like it just always came down to those 2 options, and to me it just felt like those were the only 2 options because nothing else would work to help me feel better. And so it would also help me justify my behaviors because it felt like at least I wasn't killing myself. I was using behaviors, but it was the lesser of 2 evils. And I remember I would often use that in therapy to try to justify it to my therapist that, yes, I used behaviors, but it wasn't the worst that it could be. And I think just night after night and day after day of doing that, and coming here to IOP at night and then doing my behaviors, it just really started to feel like this was my life now. And it got to the point, which I think this was like my true bottom, where I just had a small voice inside me that knew that if I kept this up, that I would either die because of my eating disorder or because of suicide, and that was going to happen. It just felt like that was if I kept going the way I was going, it would end up in death. Like, there was no other end to it. And there was that tiny voice inside of me, and that tiny voice knew that it wasn't worth it to keep doing this if I ended up dead, and that I didn't really want to die this way. And that tiny voice was enough to get me to go to residential and convince myself that that was my last hope, that I would go to residential and see if that would work, and if it didn't work, it didn't work, and I could just end up dying because of my eating disorder. So I went to residential. I was still very much in a place where I didn't think that I would be able to recover. And even though I had time away from behaviors since I was in residential, it still felt like this wasn't something that was sustainable, that I could keep doing. And so by the time that I was done with residential, my therapist told me that when I left, I should try an experiment for her. And she said the experiment was to try 30 days of recovery and just really give it a good try, because I had never really given recovery a fair shot. And so she said, just try it for 30 days. And if at the end of those 30 days you feel like going back to your eating disorder, you've had years and years of practice, you know exactly what your eating disorder is, you know how to do the behaviors, you know how you feel afterwards, you can get back into it like that. And she said, so give recovery 30 days, and if at the end of those 30 days you feel like recovery still isn't possible, go back to your eating disorder. And at that point, I wanted to try her proposition out just to prove her wrong, to prove to her that recovery wasn't possible for me and that I would just go back to my eating disorder. So I left residential with the thought of, yes, I'm going to try recovery for 30 days, but then I can just go back to my eating disorder, and I'll be justified in going back to my eating disorder because my therapist told me I could go back to my eating disorder at the end of those 30 days. And so I started trying it out, and it was really tough. I was back at Rosewood, and I just felt like without the structure of residential, I definitely had a lot of lapses, but I was determined to give recovery a fair enough shot that I would be able to just give up on recovery. And so I kept just trying to push off behaviors a little bit, and I tried a little bit at a time. So instead of acting on a behavior, instead of self-harming or instead of purging right now, I would wait an hour and see if I still felt the same way in an hour. And if I did, I would use the behavior and move on with my day. And I noticed that when I waited just an hour, I often felt the exact same way at the end of that hour. And so I would use the behavior. But I started to notice a little bit at a time that if I waited long enough, my feelings started to lessen. And that was something that people had told me a million times, that feelings are not permanent, that feelings pass, but it was never something that I had experienced. I had never sat with a feeling long enough to see that it would go away, because in my disorder, my thought was always I would feel a feeling, it would feel so unbearable that I would do a behavior to help it, and then I would just continue to feel the feeling because I would feel bad about using the behavior, and the behavior actually wouldn't work to do much. And so in my disorder, feelings felt pretty permanent. It felt like my depression was a permanent state. I felt like I was going to be depressed for the rest of my life. That was just who I was. If I felt angry, I felt like I would just feel angry or frustrated for the rest of time. I couldn't see that there was an end in sight. But when I started to push back behaviors to be like a couple hours at a time, I also started to notice that my feelings would start to decrease. And so if I was feeling really angry about an interaction I had, like 5 or 6 hours later, I wouldn't be feeling that angry. And for me, that was a big turning point, because I had never seen that feelings would decrease and that I could actually feel better without using behaviors. And so I started to build up this knowledge that kind of slowly snowballed, where I would push a behavior back for a couple hours. It would be like 5 hours. I wouldn't be feeling the same way, and this time I actually wouldn't do the behavior. So the next time I would try 6 hours, and then 7, and then it would get to the point where I would want to use the behavior, and I would tell myself, just wait until tomorrow, and if tomorrow you wake up and you're still feeling the same way, you can use the behavior then. And waiting a whole day to do a behavior was really when I started to see the biggest difference, because if you wait 24 hours, you often do not feel the same way you did 24 hours later. And so that I wouldn't end up using a behavior because it just never felt the same way as it did in the heat of the moment when I first had the urge. And so those little moments started to build and build and build, where I could go days at a time. It built onto weeks at a time. And I would always have moments where I would lapse or I'd use a behavior because there were still, at that point in my recovery, there were still those times where the emotion just felt way too strong, and I seemed to forget everything that I had learned. And I would forget that this feeling would pass, and it would just feel so intense that I would use a behavior. But the times where the emotion would feel so intense started to lessen, and they grew farther and farther apart. So I wouldn't be having these moments for like months at a time. And when I started to get that much time without behaviors, I started to build up other coping skills, and this all provided evidence for my voice of recovery that started off really tiny but now was getting louder and louder, because it was seeing that there were other things that I could do. Like I could get outside, I could walk my dog, I could even like watch a funny show, I could color, I could paint, I could dance, I could do all of these other things that actually made me feel better. And when I would have those lapses and go back into a behavior, I wouldn't feel better. And so this started to really convince me that behaviors never really did anything for me. They never actually made me feel better, and there were ways and things that I could do to make myself actually feel better, and that definitely feels really good. And so that feeling built and got bigger and bigger, and it got to the point where if I had a lapse, I would feel worse afterwards than I did before. And like, no matter how bad I was feeling, you know, how depressed it felt that I needed to use the behavior, how I felt after I used the behavior was way worse, because I would not only be feeling that depressed, but I would be feeling guilty that I relapsed or that I had a lapse. And so I started to see that. I started to push off behaviors longer and longer, to the point where I was able to go months and months and months at a time. And now I'm at a point now where I've gone 2.5 years without self-harming and purging, which is really exciting and also really crazy. Whenever I say that out loud, it just seems like it doesn't seem real, because for the longest time I felt like this wouldn't be me, that I could never be this person sitting here today. But now that I am this person sitting here today, it just makes me think about how wrong I was back then, how wrong I was that I thought that this was never possible, but I'm sitting here and I'm proving to myself that I was wrong in my eating disorder. Like, this is possible. It is possible for me, and I think it's possible for anyone to be recovered. And for me, it was just about giving recovery a chance, and just giving myself the chance to grow and to build up this foundation for my recovery, so that I could grow into the person that I am today. Thank you.